Hey, well, good morning, everybody. I'm Brent Never. I'm director of the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership. I'm very happy to have you here this morning to talk about philanthropic giving and racial equity. So this is a project that we've been working on with Gina Van Sickle for probably a year and a half now. And it's a topic that is front of mind. And hopefully today we'll talk about clearly Gina's findings, but also maybe how the environment has even changed in that year and a half. I think it's a really topical issue in perhaps in a way that we hadn't thought of it being topical when we started talking about this project. So just very quickly, um, we have a series of events coming up and would love to have you involved. First, we have our annual Nonprofit Leadership Conference on November 25th. That's the Monday before Thanksgiving. We've actually found that over the years, that is one of the best times to have something because usually people are starting to wind down that week. And it'll be a great event. We have our panels all set, and I encourage you to go to our website at mcnl.org. Also, just next week, we have our allyship series, Innovation for Inclusion, on October 24th. And then lastly, we have our annual Advanced Board Leadership course, which occurs starting this week, the 19th, the 26th, and then November 2nd and 9th. So this month we have a lot coming up. We encourage you to get involved. Some of the offerings are free, some of them are low cost, but certainly we encourage everybody to be at the table. So with that, just very quickly about this project, and then I'll turn it over to Gina. So I've known Gina for several years on several projects. Um, and this one really started over a cup of coffee at XWA, as so many projects tend to do in the nonprofit sector. And Gina had said, "Hey, I've been thinking a lot about these issues for many years, about issues of equity in our sector and in our community. And the angle that I'm particularly interested in right now is the funding environment. Gina is a managing consultant at JVS Consulting. She works on grant writing, strategies, and fundraising plans. She has a long history in our Kansas City nonprofit sector in fundraising and development. So I think it was close to her heart to think about the intersection of these two issues that are very important. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Gina. And just for ground rules, as with all navigation series, please pop in the chat any questions you have. We'll try and take them after Gina's presentation. If there's something that you really didn't understand, make sure to just put that in the chat of like, hey, could you hold up for a second? And we'll try and address that question right there. And with that, here we go.
Good morning. Thank you, everybody, for joining this morning and for having me here. UMKC was generous enough to follow my thoughts on this and fund a little study, and I appreciate it. It's very interesting. Let me just get my screen set up here. And just one thing to note. I moved up to Minneapolis with my family it's been 3.5 years now. So I have changed my business name, just kind of moved things up this way. So Brent mentioned JVS Consulting. However, the new business name is Hartenbauer Consulting. So that's why that branding is showing up on this slide. Um, I'm going to give an overview of the highlights of this project. And then, of course, unless there's something very pressing, we'll have time for conversations and questions. As Brent said, this project is a review of giving. by Kansas City Foundation specifically, which was a project we launched last fall as a way to get a feel for how foundations are addressing racial equity in their giving strategies. So as we think back to the pandemic, and especially the summer of 2020 after George Floyd's murder, which was kind of my starting place for these questions, I'm guessing most of us remember that surge of public commitments and proclamations, both in the for-profit and nonprofit worlds, to both examine how racial inequity was showing up in their organizations, if at all, along with a promise to distribute more resources to communities that have historically been without access to those resources, so BIPOC communities specifically. So based on that, the question that was rattling around in my mind that I wanted to try to answer as best as possible is, how have Kansas City philanthropies been looking at this? Um, how have they been defining racial equity, if at all? And did that summer of racial reckoning during the pandemic impact local giving patterns in Kansas City over the last 4 years, and how and by how much? So the research question is, how much of Kansas City's philanthropic funding is intentionally allocated to BIPOC-led and BIPOC serving organizations? Um, so before we move on to the findings, and I will say this is a 22-page research paper, so I don't know how many people are going to read it all the way through, and that's fine. So what I'm really trying to give is an overview, but I do hope you'll take some time to look at it, especially because these funders were so gracious with their time and the information they were willing to share. But before we move on to the findings, I want to give you a few statistics about the philanthropic industry overall so that you have some context for why this topic is so important. And these may not be new to you, but they're still worth stating. In the US, staffing across the board at philanthropic organizations looks like this. It's 92% of foundation directors are white, 89% of foundation trustees are white, 66% of foundation program officers are white. Revenue for Black-led charities in particular is 60% less, and Black-led charities hold 76% less unrestricted net assets than their white-led counterparts. This last statistic, the 8.5%, is a little misleading because it refers to Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led organizations overall. But when you disaggregate the 8.5%, you will find that just over a little, 2% goes specifically to Black-led organizations annually. The same statistic of Latinx-led organizations. About 1.5% goes to Asian Pacific Islander-led organizations, and less than 1% goes to Indigenous-led orgs. So if you're somebody who can do math quickly in your head, which I'm not, but you might realize that this isn't mathematically adding up to the 8.5%, but this source that I found is from 2008. So we can assume that these percentages have probably gone up a little bit, especially with all of the recent more intense focus on racial equity. But we can see that 8.5% isn't even in the ballpark of equity. And finally, when it comes to actual and specific plans, only 25% of family foundations have formal DEI policies and practices. And I want to couch that with the understanding that family foundations make up more than half of all registered foundations in the US. So it's a big chunk that don't have plans. So when we're talking about plans that foundations make that might start to close these gaps, that's one of the things I was seeking to uncover. Do local foundations have plans in Kansas City to move toward more equitable giving strategies? And if so, what are they? And actually, before I jump to this, I just want to go quickly back to the slide here with my research question to make an important note. Even though the intention was to get some sort of numerical value to answer this question, like how much by dollar amounts has giving changed, only one foundation in the study was able to answer that. So For all intents and purposes, this turned into more of like a qualitative understanding of what's happening in the local community in these different foundations' own words. So we spent a lot of these interviews talking about individual stories and histories of foundations, aspirations, and that's more of what this final report is based on. So back to where we were, we sent out 25 email invitations to major Kansas City philanthropies back in the fall, asking for study participants to sit down with me for a brief one-on-one interview to reflect on racial equity within their giving practices. And the list of questions we used is is one of the appendix items of the study. And out of that 25 that we sent invitations to, 11 agreed to participate. Of that 11, 7 were working toward formal racial equity plans, with one, as I said, able to articulate the change in specific dollar amounts going to BIPOC-led and BIPOC-serving organizations, and how that giving for them has changed since 2020. Another one of the 7 said that they were working on numbers and that those would be published in about a year to a year and a half. 2 of these 11 foundations acknowledged that racial equity was important, but they did not plan on adopting any formal racial equity policies or practices. Of the remaining 2, one was hesitant to declare any formal plan. However, it was clear that they had started adopting some of the strategies that are identified as best practice in closing racial equity gaps, which I'll talk more about in a minute. The final grant maker of these last 2 was unclear, even though their philanthropy has adopted fairly strong racial equity language in their mission statement and on their website. The president of the foundation was unable to articulate specific steps and strategies toward meeting this goal in comparison to the other organizations in the study. So as I said, each foundation sat down to about a 45-minute interview, and they were asked a series of questions related to their organization's history, philosophies of giving, how they viewed the increased focus on racial equity and philanthropy, and how they'd chosen to respond to that focus, if at all. And out of these interviews, there were 4 consistent themes that showed up: self-evaluation, community building, reduce barriers, and experimentation. So we are going to look at each of these individually. So for self-evaluation, even though a lot of foundations talked about having had previous conversations about racial equity, and even trying to address it to an extent in their organizations, what I heard a lot was there was a real sense of urgency after George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police. A lot of directors in the interview talked about really looking at their foundation's history, taking stock of their own, in a lot of cases, complicity in perpetuating inequitable systems. One organization, for example, was working on adopting a more comprehensive racial equity statement. And there was what the director described as a lot of anxiety about the process and wanting to get it just right. And she said that up to almost the very moment of publishing this new statement, she was getting calls from trustees and board members and others. They were like, wait, are we saying we're racist? And her response was yes. It may have been unintentional, but we've absolutely perpetuated racist practices in our history. She described how naming that and owning that has been a critical part of moving forward. And I want to stop for a second and just ask, can everybody still see the entire screen? Is it showing up all right?
There's that box. There we go. Now it's yep.
Oh, it keeps popping up. All right. Well, I will do my best, and we may just all have to roll with it. So let me go back here. Also, every one of the 7 foundations moving toward racial equity-based practices talked about how much they'd been educating themselves about systemic racism over the last 4 years. Things like reading books. One funder started kind of a book club or a conversation group with other funders in the community. Another talked about having spent a lot of time after learning a lot more about systemic racism, trying to educate other philanthropic-minded people within her church. There were a lot of references to DEI trainings, attending more workshops and things of that nature. And there was also for some of the foundations, which I thought was kind of interesting, an intentional shift in vocabulary. So, for instance, moving from more general terms that we're all familiar with and have been over the years, like cultural competency or social justice, a more explicit language to signal these disparities like privilege, white supremacy, and white saviorism. And finally, one of those seven foundations moving toward closing the racial equity gap, um, of all of them, all were in various stages of operationalizing or formalizing a racial equity giving plan. Some were definitely further along that continuum of change than others, but all seven were working towards some kind of permanent change. And some examples of operationalizing this included things like creating new funding streams specifically for BIPOC communities and reducing barriers to funding, which we will talk about here in a minute. The second theme, community connection, speaks to a method that a lot of these funders were using as a way to increase um, their understanding of how their grantees and even others who have not been grantees feel about their funding processes. And they really described community connection in three main ways. Hosting community conversations and listening sessions with BIPOC nonprofit leaders to solicit honest feedback about their grant seeking experiences. And one of the more comprehensive examples of this is the Reach Healthcare Foundation Centering Black Voices 2-year pilot, which led to a pivot in the way that Reach approaches grant making. You can read more about that in the study that they published called Centering Black Voices Lessons from a 2-year pilot program in the Kansas City region. But other foundations talked about physically getting out in the community more, showing up at events and making themselves more visible, or asking their grantees what types of changes they wanted to see to the grant making process. Foundations have used this feedback to start restructuring their grant making processes. And the most common restructuring included things like making applications simpler, reducing reporting requirements, and again, creating new funding streams specifically for BIPOC leaders and communities. And the foundations that are working toward racial equity also frequently mentioned seeking recommendations from their peers on who they're funding and who else to talk to in the community. Of the 7 funders in the study who are working toward racial equity, the most common strategy mentioned was trust-based philanthropy, which a lot of us are familiar with. It includes 6 main principles, which I've listed here, but I won't read all of them. But all of the foundations, even those not actively implementing racial equity plans, all 11 of the respondents in these interviews reported adopting one or more of the principles, but none had implemented all of them. So the most common trust-based principles adopted were, again, reducing barriers to funding, expanding efforts to seek prospective grantees beyond usual networks, soliciting and acting on grantee feedback, and simplifying application and reporting processes. And to a lesser extent, a couple of funders did mention offering more capacity building help and recommending grantees to other funders where there was alignment. And I think the reason, I've had to kind of think about this, but I think the reason we saw that this across the board, even for foundations who explicitly said we're not going to create racial equity plans, was really more of a function of having reduced a lot of those application and reporting procedures during the pandemic in order to get money out the door faster. And then, once the pandemic waned, some just decided to permanently adopt those easier practices. What I found was that an area where funders still struggle is transparency. In the lexicon of trust-based philanthropy, transparency refers to open and honest communication between foundations and their grantees. But as I wrote in this report, transparency or the lack, hold on just a second, or the lack thereof also encompasses how foundations engage with the nonprofit community even before a nonprofit applies for a grant or becomes a funding partner. Um, and this really includes a deep dive for foundations into looking at the ease or difficulty for nonprofits to even find and apply for grants with their foundation. Um, Understanding how the foundation is making funding decisions, and just the protocol for forming connections with decision makers at their foundation isn't necessarily obvious unless you have been in the nonprofit profession for a while. Um, One example, I had a foundation director tell me that as she was getting out into the community more, she was really surprised to find out or to hear the number of people tell her they didn't really know where to find the foundation or how to get in touch with them. And to her, she felt like, just call the number and you'll be forwarded to one of the program officers. But again, that's something that I think becomes more intuitive to a lot of us who have worked in the nonprofit field for a while, and maybe more importantly, don't feel intimidated to reach out because we kind of know the rules of engagement. Um, so in a lot of cases, I think that the lack of transparency really kind of has less to do with intentionally gatekeeping or withholding information. Although, I had at least one funder tell me that they would not make it easier to find them because they weren't staffed to deal with the kind of flood of applications that would come in as a result. But I think for the most part, the lack of transparency has more to do with the challenge of breaking out of old traditions and habits. Um, like other funders reported resistance to change, specifically with their trustees. So I heard a lot about having to educate directors and program officers, having to educate their boards. But even then, I heard stories about trustees who were hesitant to adopt too many changes too quickly. And at least one director told me that she was purposely going slow because she wanted these changes to outlast her tenure after she left. Um, Foundations that were kind of further along the continuum of change had some things to say about this resistance, which I thought was interesting, about local funders in the community. At least one of the foundation directors pointed out that there isn't an incentive to change. So I think that's a really important point to make about philanthropy in general. She said, quote, "I'm part of a family foundation forum, and when it comes to family foundations, they can do whatever they want. I've been surprised by how many are really clear that racial equity is just not an interest and not going to be part of their policies moving forward." Um, and that's really true and kind of plays into the transparency piece. There isn't a lot of information out there about best practices for more equitable grant making. I mean, there's a lot of writing about it, there's a lot of white papers, but I think people are still sort of feeling their way through. Um, there isn't a professional philanthropic review body, industry code of ethics, or a professional certification that kind of would help funders look at regulating the selection process or the criteria they use for grant making, for example. So because of this and the resistance to change by some of the trustees that I heard about, um, many foundations, again, are having to kind of feel their way through it, work within the perceived boundaries of their individual organizations to identify the choices or the changes that they feel like they can make. So this leads us to the final theme, which is experimentation. A lot of foundations were looking at experimentation by testing small grants. So I heard a lot about foundation leaders who we're not quite in a place where they were going to dedicate large sums of money to these racial equity plans yet, but instead we're testing smaller grants through smaller funding streams with a hope to kind of pull those organizations that are, untested into larger funding streams in the future. They also talked about a lot of risk mitigation. So, a lot of the testing really has to do with eliminating risk, uh, which is kind of something that I think happens often with um, it's something that organizations led by BIPOC individuals face because, again, they don't have as much access to the funding. Um, Interestingly, I think experimentation is really where there seemed to be the biggest gap in viewpoints among funders. So while everyone could acknowledge that racism exists in funding, not every foundation wanted to pursue fundamental changes to their giving practices. So for those who wanted to change, most were adopting, again, some variation of the same techniques like trust-based philanthropy, but really that challenge comes when it's time to distribute the money. And in my interviews, there seemed to be a really clear delineation between the funders who want to experiment their way through racial equity and those who want a more expeditious and direct approach. So the criticisms from foundations that are giving more were things like one director said, there's so much money in Kansas City. We still haven't made the changes we purport to want to change. In this case, the criticism was essentially that there's enough money to start really tackling these issues, but not enough will to do so. And in fact, it should be noted that a common criticism of this experimental approach is that, again, BIPOC organizations have historically faced underinvestment, which you could see in those first slides, the stat slide. So much so that it would actually take a more significant allocation of resources, even beyond normal giving ranges, to chip away at these persistent disparities in philanthropy. One foundation director argued that Kansas City foundations have a lot to make up for. She mentioned how much money is sitting in investment accounts, making more money, not really doing anything for anyone. Another said, on the one hand, we say we want innovations and creativity. We want your bold new ideas, but then we undermine that by falling back on old giving patterns and habits. Um, so again, there was just kind of a divide in the interviews between those funders who are approaching racial equity with experimentation, and those funders who've kind of worked through the experimental phase and think foundations are moving way too slowly. And because we have almost gone, or I've almost gone half an hour, I'm going to skip this slide and just kind of talk about the so what. So where does that leave us? So an important thing to note is that this project represents a snapshot of a small group of funders at one particular point in time. These interviews were also really brief, so just 45 to 60-minute conversations with only one or two representatives from each organization. So it would be hard to, and probably not appropriate to make huge generalizations about the state of giving in Kansas City related to racial equity gaps. But I do think that these interviews give an important glimpse into how funders are processing the idea of racial equity and their role in achieving it. And if we do take a look at some of the larger, kind of bigger data points from other national sources, you might find, or you will find that after an uptick in racial equity-based giving in 2020, the flow of resources to BIPOC-led and BIPOC-serving organizations is diminishing. According to one study, only about a quarter of the foundations they interviewed for this study are providing more multi-year and unrestricted funding compared to pre-pandemic levels, despite pledges to do more. Also, experimenting with different racial equity strategies is certainly an essential part of identifying the most effective funding approach. However, again, research indicates that this experimentation must be accompanied by a more substantial flow of resources. Definitions of substantial would obviously vary from organization to organization based on capacity and assets. But because of the longstanding underinvestment in BIPOC communities without a significant allocation of resources, even beyond normal giving ranges, BIPOC communities will continue to face systemic and persistent financial disparities they may not be able to overcome. Um, Addressing race head on is key on virtually every systemic issue, from health to education to economic status. One's race and ethnicity are the single biggest predictor of lifelong health and wellness outcomes. The authors of an Echoing Green study that I found suggested that if you're asking how to reduce or eradicate the biggest challenges in your community, and you're not viewing these challenges through a race-based lens, you'll inevitably arrive at the wrong answer to solve them. In Kansas City alone, in comparisons between white and Black households, Black median incomes are 62.9% of white median incomes. The net worth of Black households is only 1.2 or 12.8% of that of white households. Black Kansas Cityans have shorter lifespans, have higher fetal death rates, have less access to quality education, are more likely to be incarcerated, are more likely to be racially profiled and killed by police. In total, if quality of life were handed out like pies, according to the Urban League of Kansas City, white Kansas Cityans would get 100% of the pie, while Black Kansas Cityans would only receive 2/3. So I think in our local community, we definitely have work to do. And moving towards racial equity is ongoing. It is challenging. One quote that I love that I found from Denise St. Omer in the same Urban League of Greater Kansas City publication points out that moving the needle on persistent racial disparities requires a long-term commitment and a deep understanding of systemic racism. And I did see foundations willing to do the work. Not everyone, but there was movement, and that was good to see. So I'll close by repeating something somebody or one of the funders said to me. In the context of our conversations, she was telling me that she had a lot of sympathy listening to foundations talk about how hard it is to shift decades and sometimes centuries of outdated, deeply ingrained internal policy or philosophies and ideologies around giving. But she was adamant again that this is a choice. There are changes all foundations can be making, no matter how big or how small. Edgar Villanueva in Decolonizing Wealth pointed out that the way we do philanthropy is really, again, a design choice. So besides the requisite tax laws and accounting rules that foundations have to follow, how and who the money gets distributed to, that's really up to each individual foundation. As Villanueva says, and this funder that I interviewed echoes, we have the power to change the design and to close the gap on racial disparity in philanthropy. So that is just kind of an overview of the study. And I'm open to any maybe questions you have, thoughts you have. I would love to hear other people's experiences and kind of your view of how you've engaged with philanthropy in Kansas City.
Well, thank you, Gina. And so we are going to open it up for questions. I see Rhonda, one of my favorite people in the world, posted a question. But I have a real basic question first, just more like point of information, which is I know you thought very hard about what funders you should be talking to. So how did you go about selecting these? So it wasn't just willy-nilly, I'm calling these five that I know.
Yeah. Well, we had taken a look at the annual listing of the top foundations by giving. And it wasn't willy-nilly, but I will say that I did kind of narrow it down to foundations. I've been a grant writer for a really long time and in profit for a very long time. I did kind of narrow it down to the foundations that have a fairly open application process. Definitely foundations that primarily give in the Kansas City community. And those I know who, a lot of my counterparts in my work interact with pretty frequently. I wanted to try to get a summary of what's happening with, again, those organizations that most of us engage with pretty often for the work that we do in the community.
Well, great. Well, so Rhonda has the question, how does Kansas City stack up against other communities in regards to just the orientation towards equity and in giving?
Mhm. Um, One of the funders I thought was interesting. This was a BIPOC leader at one of our local foundations that said, and her viewpoint was a little different, I think, than others, that even though she sees movement locally, people are talking about it more, they're considering it more here and even nationally, it's harder when it comes to actual action to find some really good models. I think that as long as we've been talking about racial equity and philanthropy, there's still kind of a gap in, well, I should say this. We're really still, I think, in baby steps, especially as white-led foundations or white-led organizations trying to figure out the best approach. Um, and I will just kind of wrap up that comment by saying we do know, however, that there are best practices in giving. Um, and I think a lot of us know this probably instinctually. Obviously, giving more to BIPOC communities or BIPOC-led organizations, but also more unrestricted grants, continuous multi-year funding, and just continuing to reduce those barriers, the application processes, the reporting. Um, so I don't know that I can't tell you what's happening in every other single city. A lot of the research I was looking at was across the board, was national, and it was all kind of the same challenges and questions. But I'm not sure, this is my own take. I'm not sure that it's that complicated or as complicated as we make it.
So, so I have a question about, and this is sort of maybe arguing the other side to say, well, we live in a world here in Kansas City that, you know, unfortunately or fortunately, race amongst other divisions permeates everything that our sector does. And so to sort of artificially cleave off a part of funding to say, well, this is special funding only for particular uses, misses the point that we live in this sort of world where, there's so many other ways that we interact with these issues. Um, what would funders say about that? Did you hear any of that? Just thoughts.
Yeah, I definitely had funders say completely justifiably that just increasing the amount, like numbers that don't tell the whole story, obviously, like just saying I'm going to write bigger checks to BIPOC-led organizations or that benefit BIPOC communities um, doesn't, doesn't tell the whole story. There are other factors involved. But I thought, so I started a conversation with a local funder. I think it's the one that sticks in my head the most. Um, when she talked about how they've sort of switched their giving, what they actually did is they put a literal physical map on the wall and they charted where their funding goes. So where are the pockets on this map where most of their funding goes? Then they kind of overlaid the areas or the challenges that they were most interested in addressing, or at least that their mission statement says they're trying to address. So, like health outcomes, childhood education, things like that. And what they found was their money wasn't actually matching up with the areas of greatest need in the city. So that was a big shift for them. So that wasn't about necessarily offering more as it was about just getting to the root of are we doing what we say we're doing? Um, and the other thing that I thought was great was as they go into these communities, they're asking folks that they fund, or if they're going into, like a social service agency, they're asking people who receive those services, where else do you go within a certain mile radius to receive other services, and then connecting with those organizations. So they're really doing a deep dive in trying to connect the dots. Um, that said, since I'm a numbers person, the issue is still that we have these huge gaps. So when we're just sort of just gesticulating over, the philosophy of, well, we do this, do we do this, do we do this, and we get stuck in that, which I do think that a lot of funders kind of get stuck in that. Um, we're just not closing that gap. Um, and it's sort of a cliched thing to say, but one of the funders, said we really should be working ourselves out of a job. Ideally, we would be, if not fully sunsetting, we would be looking at our ways to release more funding and approve more funding.
In another question that I had down, you hinted at the stakeholders that funders work with, and obviously we're in the sector. A lot of us here on the call are in the sector. So we think about our clients and our people with whom we work. But, funders have stakeholders such as their founder, their board of trustees. Could you go a little bit deeper if you had any other conversations about how those conversations go?
Mhm,
Um, trying to educate their stakeholders.
mhm. Something I don't think that I mentioned, because I did skip over a slide. I'm not totally sure what this phenomenon is about. I could probably figure it out, or give my take on it. But it did seem to me that these smaller foundations were more flexible than foundations with larger, net assets. So for those foundation leaders, those conversations, they had a lot of trust from their boards. It didn't quite take as much work to move the needle on those. I'm going to try to articulate this, and I may do a really sloppy job at it, but I feel like there's some tension here for me, where you have a very large organization and everything's operationalized more, and you have, you're pulling more, let's say, PhD experts into your staff, or you're really spending a lot of time trying to intellectualize what you're doing. Um, and again, we just kind of missed, I feel like, sort of the simpler pieces. Like we, as one of the funders said to me, again, like there's all of this money that's sitting in Kansas City making more money. It's really not doing anything for us. It's not doing what we say it's going to do. Um, and I think, again, when you're taking a lot of time to sort of like intellectualize why that's happening, or come up with the best possible plan, uh, we're kind of wasting time. But to answer your question more specifically, some of the resistance, one funder had said to me that her board of trustees sort of saw racial equity like a trend, um, not necessarily trying to like demean or diminish it, but like it was kind of, we've invested in these kinds of trends or phases before, and we've gotten burned. I didn't quite get an answer as to what that means. I assume it means that they expected a particular outcome and didn't get it, but that it had made them hesitant to take these, what they saw as risks, on new organizations. So, Brent, I think that I can't really answer that honestly, because it's so different depending on the foundation. And when trustees kind of have that attitude, or they're resistant, or it's hard for them to break out of tradition, Those organizations truly aren't really moving on this and didn't really have a clear view on when and if they would at all.
Yeah. How about just talking about today? And so, I alluded to the fact that our coffee 18 months ago, we were in a certain headspace about these issues. And today, I just sort of feel in the US more generally, and perhaps in Kansas City, I don't want to overgeneralize the discussion has evolved, let's just say. Do you feel like, and this just gets to what you were saying before, is the feeling that this is sort of a trend that has moved along, or is this something where no, in Kansas City we do understand that this is a structural issue that's been here for a very long time and potentially will be here for a very long time, and we're sort of in it to win it. Did you get any sense of people seeing this as a longer term issue?
You want intellectual me or cynical me?
How about you? Just you.
um, well, again, I want to be really careful that these things that I found were not generalizable. It was an idiographic conversation study. I would need to talk to many more funders, probably longitudinally across a period of time. Like nobody could really give me numbers or stats except this one particular funder. So I really can only give you my feeling, and some of it may be fair, some of it may not. I was maybe surprised by the sophistication of the conversations that foundations are having about racial equity and even racial justice. And we haven't even talked about racial justice. Equity and justice are very different. Um, so, in that sense, it felt promising. Having moved up to the Minneapolis area, where I don't know that the stats would necessarily look any different, but maybe the difference is we're not having debates about does racism exist, which I think is kind of like politically and hard in Kansas City and Missouri that in some ways we're still stuck there. Um, I was really impressed by the depth of thought and conversations I was able to have. That said, I do think the problem is that tended to happen more with like the healthcare foundations who are legally required to be transparent in how they fund. They answer more to the community rather than their trustees or, family members who started the foundations. There was more movement, I would say, among these smaller organizations, not so much the organizations with higher amounts of assets. And that to me is a little troubling because when you have foundations that have billions of dollars or millions of dollars and they're not really changing, um, the smaller foundations can't be expected to carry that load on their own. So, you know, there's movement. How like demonstrably impactful that will be 10 years from now. I'm a little I'm feeling a little cynical about that. But it's there. Like it's the possibilities are there.
Right.
That
Right.
was really unsatisfactory answer for me.
No, well, I think it sort of it speaks a bit to the project, which is, again, I think when we spoke, I do a lot of work that's kind of quantitative. I know, Gina, you like to go deep and also understand, the why questions. And the project really started in my mind of, well, we'll quickly get a sense of how, the top 15 foundations and what percentage of funding goes to this type of work versus that type of work. And then we can do some interviews afterwards. And really, I think what you're saying, Gina, is other than maybe one or two, they didn't have a sense of how much money would be going towards these types of initiatives. Partly definitionally, how do we define what that is? And that is an absolutely fair kind of idea. And partly, I think what you were saying is they just hadn't gotten there in their giving yet to even think about this as being a category. Um, and so it was just a lot harder than
Yeah.
we had thought.
Brent, I'm curious how you would answer that question that you just asked.
Um, about where we've moved in
Yeah,
our
where
dialogue.
where you feel like things are with your experience.
You know what? So I am a glass half full sort of person in the sense that and I believe this in my heart that our nonprofit sector, which is the other half of this discussion that we're not really focusing on, really does focus on a lot of these issues. And therefore, if funders maybe don't have ex, you know, discrete streams of funding that are going in this way, I think nonprofits are focusing, if not explicitly on race and equity, at the very least on the implications of a racialized region. Um, and so the nonprofits, I think, are steering the conversation um, in ways that funders maybe have caught up to or are going to have to catch up to. So that would be my way of thinking about it. Um, and also, I think, as you said, some of the healthcare foundations are really out front in on this issue and really, I think, pushing a regional dialogue that I think is a productive dialogue. And dialogue also means that there should be a back and forth.
Yeah.
It's not this is the party line and then we all need to believe it, that we really can kick the tires and think about theories of change and think about what might work and what might not and be okay with that.
Mhm.
Um, and that's one thing that at the Midwest Center, I'm hoping that we can have more dialogue about. We need to have people from all areas with all viewpoints able to come forward and really kick the tires on some of these issues, as I know in private conversations people are really wrestling with right now.
Yeah. I'd also just say I some of the foundations that are a little further along um, talked a lot about getting phone calls from their peers asking, what are you doing? Who are you funding? Kind of asking for advice. And I like that too. And I think that's always kind of, Kansas City, we have had a lot of, I think, foundations partner up to address big challenges like early childhood education, as an example, or even the Reach Foundation and others when they did the Cultural Competency Initiative starting about a decade ago. Um, and so I really do hope that this is a place where foundations feel like they can collaborate and tackle the issue collectively, like they have with some other challenges in the past. I think that could be really, really helpful.
Um, so with this, are there any final questions from the group? We'll give you a chance to weigh in if you want to. Thank you, Brenda, for posting the Grant Makers in Health report. That's an interesting report on this issue. Terry.
Good morning. Good morning, Brandon and everyone. My head is about to pop off of my shoulders. Um, Jean, thank you so much for putting all of this together. A couple of years ago, some friends and I had this exact same conversation to talk about how we could really tell how foundations were supporting BIPOC organizations. And we literally started at pulling 990s and looking to see where funding was going and to begin to organize that information and to share it. like a scorecard. And one of the things that I've always felt was important. Kansas City is the most generous. I won't say the most because I have no idea what other folks do, but so much money and so much generosity, and it blows my mind that we can't figure out how to address so many of the issues that we have in Kansas City. And when I started to ask, how are we monitoring? How are we tracking? We literacy for me. How are we tracking the money spent, where it's being spent, the outcomes that are coming from these organizations? And nobody can say. And I just think that's an abomination that this much money is being given out annually for years, for decades, and we can't speak to how the boats have been lifted. And I think I appreciate this in-depth conversation. I appreciate Midwest Center for taking a look at it. And Brent, I would love to talk to you after this meeting because I have some thoughts about how we can begin to um, take advantage of the wealth that we do have in our community and take advantage of the brain trust that we have from organizations that have been doing this work a really long time and beginning to put metrics and monitoring around how foundations are supporting the things that need to be done in Kansas City.
That's great, Terry. And I think, it's funny. Here I am, one of the PhDs that intellectualize. So sorry, but there isn't very good data about foundations. There's grant making data. It's a little bit clunky and not very good data. And it is hard to then put things in categories, partly because definitionally we have a tough time to say, well, what are we talking about and how can we categorize it? That being said, Terry, I think this is a good start for us to in Kansas City start this conversation about how we could categorize giving. And Gina, I think it was a great point that we have had initiatives in our philanthropic community before that several funders have gotten around, and we can have those conversations about measurement, just in the sense of it's good for everybody to know where these resources are going, and have conversations about whether this is moving the needle over the medium term, not next year. That's one of our problems is short-termism in how we address really large problems. Um, so thank you, Terry. Um, well, with that, we always end on time. I want to thank Gina so much. Again, please find our report. It's in the chat. It's on our website, and we absolutely encourage you to do that. Also, we're making a more condensed blog post. We'll put that up and put it through our LinkedIn also. Again, wonderful work. Gina, thank you everybody for attending. And please do check out our website for our future offerings.